The time is now for the Dr. Bob Sports Podcast. I am Tanner. I am our head of analytics. And for the past 6 years, I've been working alongside Bob, originating our NFL and college basketball bets. And today, as always, I'm joined by our digital media specialist, Grant. How are we doing?
Doing great, Tan. Pumped for today. I'm repping my Huskers. We got a little week 0 game. So by the time everyone's seeing this tomorrow, it'll be Friday. And you can comment if we lost and make fun of me, or maybe I'll comment back and say something nice about how we just whooped on Minnesota.
Yeah, I kind of like the Gophers in that matchup, but we're getting so close to the NFL season. We just released our first NFL bets to clients, and I'm not going to say what those were on the podcast, but it should be pretty obvious to those of you that were watching the screen on Wednesday. So I'm getting excited. As we record this on Thursday, we are 1 week away from Chiefs-Lions on opening night.
We've done the team previews. There's been a lot of news for all the NFL teams, but first, Tanner got a chance to sit down with Bob and preview week 1 college football, including that massive Florida State and LSU game.
All right, Bob, let's talk week 1 college football. We'll start with one of your leans on the free analysis page at drbobsports.com. Leans are a profitable 827, 694, and 30 during the last decade on the website, which converts to 54% against the spread. So what do you got in this Texas Tech-Wyoming game?
Yeah, I've had Texas Tech underrated going into each of the last 2 seasons. In fact, I've had win total best bets on the over on Texas Tech 2 years in a row, and they've cashed 2 years in a row. And last season, they cashed despite their star quarterback getting injured in the first game of the season, and they still won enough games to go over their total. Tyler Shuck is back this year, and he started his career at Oregon. It was great there. Then he came to Texas Tech under the previous coaching staff and had a really solid production his first year there, got hurt, and got hurt again last year. He returned for the last 5 games last year and was a huge upgrade from the other 2 quarterbacks that they had playing. And this in the second season now of this sort of, I don't know if you call it the Western Kentucky offense, but the offense coordinator Kitley was the offense coordinator when Bailey Zappi was at Western Kentucky. Yep. And he, of course, he was offense coordinator when Bailey Zappi was at the FCS level, and they had a great offense there. So this offense translates. And I think, Tyler Shuck is the good guy to run it. He can throw the ball accurately. He's got a strong arm, can make all the throws. He also has a pretty good runner, actually. Ran the ball for over 100 yards in the bowl game. And overall, they have 10 of 11 returning starters on offense in the second year of a system that's proven itself to be a very good system. The offensive line had some issues last year, but they're back. All of them are back. And I think overall it's just going to be a really strong offense as long as, Shuck stays healthy. I think the Texas Tech offense is going to go from, mediocre pretty much last year. They had a lot of, they were good overall last year because they knew they didn't have the quarterback to really chuck the ball down the field. Donovan Smith was the main guy last year. And so they did a lot of ball control, like a passing ball control offense, a lot of short passes, moved the chains. They had huge play differential, and they racked up a ton of yards. They'd get like 580 yards on 100 plays. It'd be something ridiculous. On a lot of these games were like that. This year, I think they're going to have more explosive plays. So from a yards per play perspective, they'll be better. They'll have fewer plays, but overall, they'll be a better offense because of the big play potential that Tyler Shuck has. Running backs are decent. So I really like Texas Tech offensively this year to improve a lot. And the defense, was a little bit underrated last year. There were a lot of plays running in their games because the offense sort of ran at a pace and the defense faced more plays because of it. They were 0.4 yards per play better than an average FBS defense last year. That'd probably be about the same this year, maybe a little bit worse against the run, a little bit better against the pass because their back 7 is where all their experience is this year. But overall, Texas Tech looks solid defensively, and I think they're going to be a lot better offensively. They go into this game, I don't think the defense is going to be much of an issue because Wyoming is a terrible offensive team. They were 0.8 yards per play worse than average offensively last season. All they could do was run the ball. They had a couple good running backs last season, a solid offensive line. Both of those quarterbacks, both those running backs, Sven is gone. He's moved on. And then McNeely was meant to be the starter this year. He averaged 5.7 yards per run last year, but he's out for the season with an ACL injury. They had Harrison Whaley, who was a really good running back at Northern Illinois. He transferred in. I thought, okay, well, our number 2 back has good experience and he's good, but Whaley's out the first 2 or 3 games of this season. So they're down to their 3rd and 4th string running backs.
Well, speaking of that, are you worried about Wyoming trying to slow this game down too much? Like, what adjustments did you make from week 0 based off the new clock rules to get Texas Tech to cover this relatively large point spread?
Well, yeah, I mean, Wyoming already runs at a slow pace. And
yeah, so could they milk the clock too much?
I don't know. Texas Tech does have a good run defense.
Okay.
And I don't think they could just sit back there and try to run the ball and milk the clock. I mean, I already have them as a pretty slow-paced team, and I have Texas Tech's offense still running at a decent tempo. But overall, that was not really the issue. I mean, that's incorporated in my model is the pace of play. I did assume that Wyoming would try to establish the run even more than they normally do, and so I shaved, a little bit of, probably a play off of what would normally be projected. And that slows things down a little bit, but it's not going to make that much of a difference. And 14 points it's not like a 28-point spread. So the running game's a bit of an issue. The guy they had, DQ James, was explosive, and I thought he might get the start here. He looks like he'll be the backup running back. And they've got a JC transfer who I've really, was the number 3 running back. It looks like, he's, I guess he was the number 2 running back, and then Whaley got hurt. It looks like he'll be the guy. James will get some carries, and they should be pretty good running the ball, but I don't think it'll be enough. Andrew Peasley, the quarterback, has never proven himself to be a reliable passer. Last year, he averaged 4.9 yards per pass play. The teams he faced would allow 7.3 yards per pass play to an average SBF quarterback. So it's probably hard to duplicate that level of ineptitude, but I don't think they'll get much better throwing the ball. Generally, quarterbacks that are that bad tend to get a little bit better just because it's really hard to be that bad. But he does have some running ability, which he probably will need. But I don't really expect much from Wyoming's offense in this game. The pace, because Texas Tech's going to run some pace. They might score 17 points is what I have projected for them, but I just think, Texas Tech's offense is going to be able to do a lot more than that, enough offensively to cover the spread. I mean, Wyoming's bread and butter is running the ball, which they'll try to do, and their defense, which has always been pretty good. In the last few years, they've always been 0.2 yards per play, around plus or minus 0.2 yards per play from a national average. Last year, they were 0.2 yards per play, worse than average. The season before that, they were also 0.2 yards per play, worse than average. And that year in 2021, they had 11 returning starters, and they were still a little bit worse than average. And I hear a lot about how good Wyoming's defense is going to be with 10 returning starters, but 2 years ago, they had 11 returning starters, and they were still a bit worse than average. I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt, and the algorithms I have project them to be 0.2 yards per play better than average, but that's nothing for Texas Tech. I mean, they see better. I mean, on average, the defenses they faced are better than that. So I have Tech favored by 17.3 points. They qualify in a pretty good double-digit road favorite situations, 41-10 angle that I used for week 1, and that'd be worth another point. So Texas Tech by 18, laying 14 would be a lean. And like I said, leans have been really good over the years, so I think Texas Tech is a pretty decent play.
All right, well, let's move over to the best game of the weekend and one of the most anticipated matchups of the entire season, LSU, Florida State. What are you thinking for that game?
Yeah, these teams are, I think, really evenly matched. I had Florida State as an underrated team at the end of last season, and everybody's high on Florida State, but I still think they might be a bit underrated here. They've improved every season under Coach Mike Norvell. They went from 3 wins to 5 wins to 10 wins last season. I had them at the end of the season ranking 6th in the nation in compensated yards per play differential.
Yeah, I remember that.
Most people might have had them more in the 10 to 15 range. So like I said, I thought they were underrated. Jordan Travis is back at quarterback, getting some Heisman buzz, and for good reason. Heisman winner Caleb Williams averaged 8.1 yards per pass play last year. Travis averaged 8.2 yards per pass play last year. And they faced similar defenses. Both both quarterbacks face defenses that would combine to allow 6.1 yards per pass play to an average quarterback. So Travis was actually slightly better in passing than Caleb Williams was last year. And Williams averaged 7.9 yards per run because he's a dual threat quarterback. Well, Travis is a dual threat quarterback, and he also averaged 7.9 yards per scramble. So, you can make an argument that Travis is every bit as good as Caleb Williams. And I do make that argument. I think that he's just a phenomenally talented dual threat quarterback, the best dual threat quarterback along with Williams. I'd give them 1 and 1A in the country. So the offense is going to be great. They have tons of returning talent back. Pretty much everybody's back. I think they have 4 returning linemen, or three all ACC linemen have come back, either second team or third team all ACC last year. The 2 spots that were opened up on the offensive line were filled by transfers that both have 30 career starts at the FBS level. They have the most combined career starts of any offensive line in at least the last 20 years. So there's a lot of experience on the offensive line. Leading rusher Trey Benson is back. He ran for nearly 1,000 yards at 6.4 yards per run last year. His backup has 976 career yards at 6.0 yards per run. So the running game with those 2 running backs along with Jordan Travis should be great. Travis has gotten better throwing the ball every single year. He doesn't make mistakes. Most running quarterbacks don't throw a lot of interceptions. So if it's not there, they just take off. And he only threw 5 interceptions last season. So he's not going to turn the ball over a lot. They can run it. They can throw it. And plus, the top receivers back. Yeah, they might go to the tight end a little bit more. They're I wouldn't say they're thin at wide receiver, but the top guys back, which is great. I think they lost the next 3 in receptions from last year's team, but they filled those spots. There's always talent at the receiver level at Florida State. Yes, I think I had their offense ranked 6th going into at the end of last year offensively, and I have their offense ranked I think 6th this year going into the season. And overall, because I think the defense is going to be great. They did lose some players from that defense, but All-American edge rusher Jared Verse is back. He had 9 sacks, 8 of the tackles for loss. They had 7 overall returning starters, or 6 maybe. But the guys that left were filled by really good players. They added first team All MAC defensive tackle Braden Fiskey, who is not only a good run stopper, but he can rush the quarterback from the middle of the line. He had 6 sacks last year.
He had 48 pressures last year.
Yeah, it's just incredible who they've gotten. Fentrell Cypress, the cornerback, defended 14 passes in 10 games for Virginia, another ACC team. So he's sliding over.
For him, I got the stat for him was 0.53 yards per cover snap allowed, which was 5th best among Power 5 cornerbacks.
He is such a shutdown corner. So they lose. That's probably an upgrade at corner.
I think so.
And they were really good defensively last year, and I think they're going to be better this year. I have them at 1.0 yards per play, better than an average defense heading into the season. Overall, they're my 6th best team overall in the nation heading into this year. Good on both sides of the ball, and I just think Florida State's a very, very good team. But
are they good enough to be a national title contender, or are they still a step below the top dogs?
No, because I think they're better than Clemson.
Okay, there you go.
I was not high on Clemson last year, and I know they still won 10 games, but Clemson, I think, was a disappointing team offensively, and I sort of thought that would be the case. I think they're better than Clemson this year. So I think there's, as good as anybody to win the ACC, as good a chance as anybody. Probably, I think they have the best chance probably to win the ACC.
There you
go. This is a key game. I mean, if you're talking about national title hopes, this is the game, right? LSU, I said that FSU was 6th best team in the country. I have LSU as my 7th best team heading into the season. They also have a dual threat quarterback. Jaden Daniels came over from Arizona State, where he was very effective for a couple years. Came in last year, the first year with the new coaching staff. He really didn't throw the ball as well as I thought he might. He's only 0.5 yards per pass play, better than an average quarterback last year. But he ran for close to 1,100 yards if you take the sacks out, at 7.7 yards per run. And overall, the Tigers were a yard per play better than an average offense when Daniels was on the field last year. He gets his top receiver back in Malik Neighbors. They've got a really good really good rushing attack. They got 4 or 5 offensive linemen returning. So I think the offense will be better. I think Daniels will get better in the second year of the system. So I expect a significant increase in his passing because he's shown that he can be that passing quarterback in addition to his running. Because at Arizona State, he had some strong passing numbers. He just wasn't as good last year as I thought. But this year, in the second year of the system, I think he'll blossom throwing the ball. And of course, he's a great runner. He led the team in rushing last year. So I think the offense is going to be great. And I think LSU's defense is going to be, this is one of those things about returning starters. Like, well, only 4 starters return to LSU's defense. Yeah, but they brought in a bunch of transfers too.
Right.
2-year starter from Texas at defensive end. The all Pac-12 first team linebacker Omar Spates is come on. They picked up a couple of defensive backs with a lot of starts in their history as well. They got the guy from Syracuse, who's the safety from Syracuse, and they picked up a guy that's a guy from Southeast Louisiana. I think is from the FCS level, but apparently he was an All-American at the FCS level. I didn't really count him as a returning starter per se, because if you're at FCS level now, you're going to the SEC. You might have been an All-American at the FCS level, but I just think you're
huge jump.
Probably a normal LSU defensive back. So I didn't add anything to their defensive rating because he was coming in, but he's been slotted to be the starter. So we'll see. I mean, he could be an upgrade. But the Tigers defense looks a little bit better than it was last year. And it was a good defense last year. So I just think both these teams are very even on both sides of the ball. Overall, my ratings favor the Seminoles by 0.7 points. And that's the difference between these two teams, but they're getting 2.5 points. If that line got to 3, might take a nibble on Florida State +3, but it's not going to get to 3. I think 2.5. I think it'll end up closing down toward 2 or 1.5. So if you're interested in playing the game, I'm not playing it, but I would rather have Florida State getting 2.5 or maybe on the money line than LSU.
All right. Well, thanks, Bob. We're going to send it back over to Grant and I doing our NFL preseason roundup.
Great.
All right, let's kick it over to our NFL preseason roundup. Let's just kick it right over here to the Ravens.
Yeah, so the Ravens have had that yearly top player goes down in training camp trend continue. It feels like every August the Ravens have someone major get hurt, and this year it's cornerback Marlon Humphrey, who had a foot injury and underwent surgery. He's expected to be back at some point in the early part of the season, but the Ravens were worried enough about that injury to sign Ronald Darby to a 1-year, nearly $2 million contract. And Darby's above replacement level. He allowed just 5.6 yards per target into his coverage last year. And it seems like the Ravens just didn't want to roll with Brandon Stevens out there again at boundary quarterback. Stevens rated 118th in PFF coverage grade last season out of 135 qualifiers. But still, I mean, Humphrey is a stud, and Darby is a 1.1 points worse than Humphrey, according to our metrics. And so the Ravens are going to be playing, significantly softer as a defense until they can get Humphrey back in the lineup.
Yeah, but they did bring in Jadeveon Clowney. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I thought it was a decent bargain. I mean, they only paid him 1 year, $2.5 million. And, he's never lived up to his first overall pick draft status, but he's been solid throughout his career. He's good against the run, decent pass rusher. And the Ravens just needed another body in there to rotate with Tyus Bauer, Odafe Owe, and David Ojabo. And last year they had Justin Houston and Jason Pierre-Paul in this role, and they just needed to sign another body. And that's what they did with Jadeveon Clowney. So I certainly don't think the Ravens have an elite pass rush by any stretch of the imagination, but I feel a little bit more comfortable now that they bring in Clowney.
Yeah, and we talked about the Bears having an absolutely terrible O-line and D-line, but they've made a move on the D-line. Tell us about what they've brought in and what it means for them.
Yeah, the Bears signed Yannick Ngakoue to a 1-year, $10.5 million contract, which seemed not nearly as good of a bargain to me as Clowney. I'm kind of shocked by the amount of money Ngakoue commanded as a free agent. I think this is just a classic case of a team paying for sacks, not pressure. And we know that pressures are a better future predictor of sacks than sacks themselves. Of the 104 players with at least 300 pass rushing snaps last season, Ngakoue had the 4th lowest pressure to sack ratio. he basically fell into a sack every 3.7 pressures that he earned, which is just way unsustainable. It's way too unsustainable. And so I don't really feel like this solves Chicago's defensive line issues, and they're still down there for one of the weakest defensive lines in the NFL to me, along with Arizona.
Yeah, and we saw the Panthers also brought in a pass rusher and Justin Houston. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, Houston's getting up there in age, going into his age 34 season. He played less than 400 snaps last year as a rotational piece for Baltimore, like we talked about, but he was still productive. He had a 14% pressure rate for the Ravens, and I think that it keeps the defense honest so they can't always double team Brian Burns on third downs for Carolina, and I like the signing.
Yeah, and how do you feel about Troy Hill being added?
Well, Troy Hill gives them an option to go with a true nickelback when they get into their dime looks and when they don't want to put safety Jeremy Chin on the inside guarding slot receivers. Hill was one of 20 qualifying nickelbacks last year to concede less than a yard per cover snap in the slot. And they hired one of the league's best defensive coordinators. I'm very excited to see what Ejiro Evero does with all those pieces on the back end. I mean, the Panthers arguably have the deepest secondary in the NFL with J.C. Horn, Von Bell, who they signed this offseason, Jeremy Chin, Dante Jackson, Xavier Woods, and Troy Hill, all above replacement level. I mean, they put Eric Rowe on the practice squad. These guys are crazy, crazy deep on the back end.
Yeah, and I think that is a position that you just love to be deep in. But let's look at our hometown kid was traded for a 7th rounder after being a top 10 pick a few years ago. Was this shocking to you?
Yeah, Grant and I are from Olathe, Kansas, which is just outside of Kansas City, and Isaiah Simmons is also from there. And the Cardinals traded him for a seventh rounder. I think Arizona just knew they weren't going to pick up his 5th-year option, which is pretty expensive for a guy that you're not sure is a part of your rebuild project. So they just wanted to get something for him before he became a free agent in next offseason. And Simmons never really fit in Vance Joseph's fire zone scheme, and he wasn't going to be someone for Jonathan Gannon's passive defensive scheme either. So now he goes to play with Wink Martindale in New York, one of the best man blitzing schemes in the NFL. Simmons had a 14% pressure rate last year, but he only rushed the passer on 7% of his snaps, and that number is going to go way up with Wink Martindale. And per PFF, when he was at Clemson, he was the only player in college football with 80-plus grades as a run defender, tackler, pass rusher, man coverage defender, and just overall defender. So Simmons, there was a reason he was taken in the top 10, and maybe if he gets in the right scheme, he can make a difference for this Giants defense. I bumped the Giants defense 0.4 points based off of that trade because I think Simmons is going to make a major difference on third down for the Giants this season.
Yeah, the kid is just a freak of nature. But let's look at the Rams. They finally made a move to kind of help out this defense. Do you like the addition of John Johnson?
Yeah, well, it's rare that you see the second best player on your defense sign on August 7th, but that's exactly what happened here. It really emphasizes how bleak it is for the Rams on that side of the ball outside of Aaron Donald. And Johnson was one of the league's best safeties in 2020, the last time he was with the Rams. It just didn't work out for him in Cleveland, but I'm not convinced that wasn't just their defensive coordinator, Joe Woods' ineptitude. And Johnson's going into his age 28 season. So he should be, he's in his prime and he could be a leader of Raheem Morris's secondary.
Yeah, and we touched on this guy last episode, but what are your thoughts on the Raiders bringing in Marcus Peters?
Yeah, well, I think it's a much better fit. Peters is an aggressive man cover corner, which worked out great when Wink Martindale was Baltimore's DC, but he didn't mesh well in Mike McDonald's system last year. Patrick Graham called the 6th most man coverage last season, so now he goes into a scheme that he's more comfortable with, and Peters immediately is Las Vegas's best cornerback and about a half point better than Brandon Facyson, who was going to be the starter before they brought in Peters.
Yeah, I think that was a great pickup for them. If you watched last episode, you know that we like the Raiders a little bit more now. But the Browns keep getting better on that D-line. Talk to us about Shelby Harris.
So Shelby Harris signed a 1-year, $3.5 million contract with Cleveland. And this Browns defensive line is nasty. Such a flip from what they've had surrounding Myles Garrett to his career up to this point. Okoronkwo had more pressures than Jadeveon Clowney on fewer pass rushing snaps last season. So that's an upgrade. Not to mention they bring in Zadarius Smith, also at edge, who ranked 6th in the NFL in pass rushing efficiency. And there's no doubt new defensive coordinator Jim Schwartz has a knack for aiding the development of defensive tackles, to where he usually has an all-pro or at least pro bowler on his defense on the interior. This includes Albert Haynesworth in Tennessee, and Ndamukong Suh in Detroit, and Fletcher Cox during his time in Philadelphia. And now they brought in, we talked about in the AFC North preview, Dalvin Tomlinson, who ranked 8th in PFF pass rushing grade last season. And now they even bring in Shelby Harris, who had an 8.8% win rate, ranking 29th among interior defenders in 2022. And for reference, last year's Cleveland starting defensive tackles, Tavion Bryan and Jordan Elliott, ranked 10th worst and 7th worst, respectively, among qualifying interior defenders in win rate. So they're massively upgrading on the interior, adding depth at edge. And I think this Browns defensive line has the chance to be the best in the NFL.
The Browns been making great moves this offseason. They are getting loaded on that defense. But let's look at maybe the biggest story for the fantasy community. What does this JT news mean to you?
Well, he didn't get traded. They put him on the PUP list. He's not going to be there available for any team week 1. So we talked about this a little bit in the AFC South preview, and I think it actually does make a difference to the Colts offense, which is unusual. Usually I'm not adjusting too much for bell cow backs because I think it just encourages offensive coordinators to call more passing plays, which in general scores more points. But in this case, the Colts don't have that much receiving talent. They don't have great pass blocking offensive line. And we saw Shane Steichen when he had a raw quarterback with Jalen Hurts in 2021. The Eagles led the NFL in run play percentage. So I think the Colts are going to pound the rock regardless of having Jonathan Taylor or not. And backup running back Zach Moss broke his arm, so he's out to start the season. So it's just Deion Jackson or Evan Hull in the backfield next to Anthony Richardson. And I mean, Taylor is a great back. He ranked 6th in rushing yards over expected last season, and the Colts could be about a half yard per carry worse without Taylor, which is worth about 2% in win probability every single game he misses until this situation is resolved.
Yeah, this has been a very weird situation to follow, but let's look over at the Bills. They've got Von Miller starting on the PUP. How big of an impact will that be?
Well, I think it makes sense for the Bills to try and peak in January and not September. So Miller ranked 9th among edge defenders in pass rushing efficiency before getting hurt on Thanksgiving. And the Bills had a clear top 10 pass rush with Miller out there. And then Miller got hurt and Gregory Rousseau picked up a high ankle sprain, and the defense, pass rush specifically, sputtered down the stretch. Now, I think the Bills will have Rousseau back, but I think Miller is a major loss because the other guys just aren't quite good enough to win unless they have one-on-ones. So Buffalo's defense might be the best in the NFL when Miller comes back into the lineup. But for now, I'm going to make a 1.5 adjustment without Miller, which is one of the bigger adjustments I would make for a defensive player.
I was going to say, that is a big point adjustment. That's one of the bigger I've ever seen you say out here. But let's look at the Broncos. So they only kept 4 receivers after cut day. If one of them is hurt, what does this tell you about what they're seeing out there?
Yeah, that was surprising. But, Judy's out now, and they lost Tim Patrick in training camp. So they're going to be relying on second-round rookie Marvin Mims right away, who is likely a half point worse than Judy. So you have to make that adjustment to start the season. And I think that Courtland Sutton might demand a massive target share in week 1. And as long as Judy is out there, because he's really the only reliable guy that Sean Payton will have at his disposal in the beginning parts of the season.
Yeah, and another receiver that might be missing in week 1, you see Seattle's going to go in without JSN and maybe Jamal Adams.
Yeah, that's 2 tough blows for Seattle on both sides of the ball. Shane Waldron likely spent all offseason perfecting his 11 personnel packages that he ran so effectively as the passing game coordinator for the Rams. with Sean McVay. And then now they're going to have to go back to that 12 stuff that they ran last year because JSN is probably not going to be available to start the season. And I think the defense gets about a half point worse without former All-Pro safety Jamal Adams. They got through nearly in the entirety of last year without him. And when he finally does come back, I think he's an impact maker, and the Seahawks defense might be undervalued when he gets on the field.
All right, and the last team we're going to look at, the Chiefs are missing some major pieces, and they've got guys not reporting and just being injured. What are your thoughts on all this?
Well, I mean, the Chiefs defense is looking shaky heading into next week's game against the Lions. The D-line will be without Charles Omenihu due to suspension, and Chris Jones might also still be holding out. Even if they do settle the contract dispute, it's unlikely that Jones will get his regular snap count because he's got to play himself into shape. I mean, he hasn't been in camp this entire time. Not to mention, L'Jarius Sneed, the Chiefs' best cornerback, is also questionable for week 1. So that all told could be a major, major blow to Steve Spagnuolo's defense, particularly Jones, who's not quite as good as Aaron Donald. But that cluster of missing Jones and Omenihu on the D-line could be worth up to 2 points for the Chiefs. I mean, Jones led all interior defenders with 77 pressures last season, and Omenihu ranked 20th in pass rushing efficiency among edge defenders. So it puts a lot on the plate for those young players, George Karlaftis and FAU. And the Lions, we know they like to play bully ball up front against a softer Chiefs defensive line. I mean, it's not shocking that Detroit has gotten so much support in the market as this Chris Jones holdout continues.
Yeah, I mean, should we expect this line to move next week if all these players are going to be out?
Yeah, well, I think the line right now is accounting for no Omenihu and no Jones. But if they rule out Sneed as well, I wouldn't be surprised to see it drop to 6, 5.5, because that Chiefs defense will be missing some of their best players.
All right, well, let's keep this Chiefs and Lions talk until next Wednesday, and we're going to come back and we're going to give you guys a short episode with a little preview of that game. So as always, make sure to like and subscribe.